Hello, my name is Dmitry Babich, and this is our three-way discussion, a platform where our guests from the United States, from Britain, and from Moscow discuss the burning issues of the week. What is an inclusive government, and why does the West fail to create it wherever it tries, from Iraq to Ukraine? Since the United States first tried its new technology of regime change in the end of the 90s, there was a lot of talk about the need for the new pro-Western regimes to be inclusive. Inclusive means representing all the minorities and all the political forces of a certain country or region. However, there are few success stories to report. Not even Washington itself concedes that the new upsurge of violence in Iraq was due to the country not having an inclusive government under the former Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki. In Ukraine, which is still agonizing after a violent change of regime that took place in February this year, elections for the new parliament are due to be held on October 26th, and again there are doubts about their inclusivity. The Party of Regions and the Communist Party, the traditional representatives of Ukraine's Russian-speaking eastern regions, are not running at this election. The reason is constant violence and harassment against the Party of Regions, a de facto ban imposed on the Communist Party. It is already clear that the new Rada will be dominated by Ukrainian nationalists. So why does the West fail to create inclusive governments? Or why does it deliberately avoid creating inclusive governments in Iraq, in Ukraine, in Bosnia, and even in Libya? We are joined from the United States by Kevin DeJesus, an adjunct professor of social sciences at Johnson and Wales University. Mr. DeJesus is also an editor at H Mideast Politics, an academic network that brings together experts on the Middle East. From London, we are joined by Frank Furedi, emeritus professor of sociology at the University of Kent in Canterbury. And in Moscow, we have in our studio Alexander Kuznetsov, vice president of the Geo-Arabica Research Center. Frank Furedi, we hear this term inclusive government more and more often, but what exactly does it mean? Aren't all governments, to a certain extent, not quite inclusive, just by their mere nature, that you can't take all the people from a certain region or a certain country into the power structures?
Well, the trouble with the term inclusivity is that it sounds very good in theory, but in practice it tends to become a fairly meaningless term that conveys ideas of whoever is putting it forward. So one of the problems that we have is that whoever is part of an inclusive government tends to be the government that kind of favors the authors of that inclusivity. One of the problems that we have in many societies in the Middle East and in Europe and elsewhere is that whenever there is an attempt to create an inclusive government, it's got an element of artificiality about it. We saw this, for example, in Iraq, where the people that are put in government are not necessarily representative of people on the ground. They tend to be self-appointed leaders who have a close relationship with, in this case, the United States or whichever power is involved in the regime change. And when you look at the governments that have been constructed in places like Libya or in Iraq or in certain parts of the Balkans, they've tended to be very much artificial creations that do not necessarily represent the hopes and aspirations of real people on the ground. And I think it is important to realize that whatever the intentions of the authors of these inclusive governments, they've constructed something that bears not very much of a relationship to the realities of the problems facing the people. A genuine government that's genuinely representative comes up from below. It comes about through a historic process where there's an organic relationship between communities and the governments that are then created. And this is a very different trajectory than the one that comes about by the artificial construction of these so-called inclusive governments.
Well, that's a very good point, and I would like to address this question to Kevin DeJesus. We have just watched on television how the U.S. Congress approved the financing for the training of Syrian rebels in Saudi Arabia, on the Saudi Arabian territory. But it's a strange situation. The United States has been supporting the Syrian opposition for, I guess, 3 years now. And the results are terrible. The war spilled into Iraq. Something happened which the former Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki warned about. But instead of punishing the people who basically supported the civil war and the insurgency in Syria, the United States toppled al-Maliki and replaced him with a new prime minister. What's your take on that? Can the United States claim that the new government in Iraq is going to be inclusive?
It's important at this point to sort of untangle a few issues here. Mm-hmm. They are highly connected and of course, intersecting, but we need to untangle. First of all, the idea, the concept of an inclusive government which represents sectors of a society that is diverse, mm-hmm. is in and of itself not exclusively a Western concept, nor is it something that is, I think, to be understood exclusively in the terms in which, for instance, the Bush administration pushed for democracy occurring on its own terms. Rather, the idea of endeavoring to promote, to push for inclusive governments is, in fact, to attempt to sort of override local structures that have long been supported and created through colonialism and upheld, for instance, in situations like Iraq, where the United States pushed for Nouri al-Maliki's, role as prime minister. I think we have to sort of, tease out political agendas from the actual concept of what a inclusive government can be about. It's not a concept that the West owns, nor should it be. However, various governments in the West in particular have sought political models which could help to reduce conflict. In fact, in the conflict prevention, conflict resolution field, there are a vast array of theories and models and possible governance practices that would attempt to facilitate greater participation and a more balanced representation from groups that have been traditionally marginalized. For instance, an example of this is consociational democracy, what we see in Lebanon, where particular roles of power are assigned to particular identity groups. Now, of course, as Dr. Freddy has said, that this is an artificial structure. However, in some circumstances, it has seemed to work, at least in terms of preventing all-out conflict. In other situations, it clearly doesn't work. The question is, the United States has now decided that it will openly and with full congressional authority support the Syrian rebels. The question is, and again, this is where the untangling of this is important, is whether or not, if the Syrian rebels are able to take over the government's military power, overpower it, and actually defeat the Assad regime, which I do not believe that it will, can they deliver an inclusive government? And that is another entire question that we have seen, in many ways, great failures.
Well, that's a very good point, Kevin. I think that you were right to cite the example of Lebanon, which had been a success story until, as far as I remember, 1974, when a civil war started there. But indeed, it was a success story, but I think it doesn't contradict what Mr. Furedi has said, because in Lebanon, democracy grew from that country's history of cooperation between various communities. But this is the question that I would like to ask Alexander Kuznetsov from GeoArabica. Do the so-called moderate rebels in Syria, do they have the guts not only to defeat the regime of Bashar al-Assad, but also to be a counterweight to the Islamists, who even the American press concedes that the Islamists from Jabhat al-Nusra and from the Islamic State, they were the strongest fighters against Assad during the civil war there. So sometimes I get an impression that the United States is overestimating the fighting capabilities of the so-called moderate rebels.
Dmitry, you are absolutely right, because there is only one so-called moderate group in the Syrian military opposition. It is the Free Syrian Army. And in the beginning of the crisis, the Free Syrian Army was the unique oppositional military group. But now this group has been disintegrated because most of the fighters of the FCA joined other rebel groups, extremist rebel groups such as Jabhat al-Nusra or Islamic States. The rebel fighters in Syria are in strong opposition to the regime of Bashar al-Assad. But they are not ideologically motivated. They come to the military groups which win the victory, which are more successful.
Which are the strongest ones.
Which are the strongest one, which are the most successful. If you will look at the spectrum of the oppositional group, 80% of the rebels in Syria are now the Islamists. It is not only Jabhat al-Nusra, but, for example, Livat Tawhid, it's a group of the Muslim Brotherhood, Ahrar al-Sham, Sukur al-Sham, and so on. In the end of the past year, Americans and Saudis tried to create the so-called moderate group, the Islamic Front. But all the commanders of this group are the Salafis, which hate Christians, for example, which hate Alavis. And now they say, yes, we are moderate. But what will they say after the victory?
Here I would like to ask Frank Furedi. Sometimes I get an impression of complete impunity, I'm sorry, for the Western politicians, because Nouri al-Maliki warned that a civil war in Syria was dangerous for his country also, that there were terrorists operating in Syria. And the American media and the British media, correct me if I'm wrong, but I remember how they for 2 years said that, you know, the opposition fighters whom the Syrian state media calls terrorists. So the Western media did not acknowledge the presence of terrorists among the opposition fighters. The Western media said the Islamists were about 2 or 3% of the huge liberal front of opposition fighters. And now instead of Mr. Obama or Mrs. Clinton facing the consequences, it was Nouri al-Maliki who was kicked out of the government. Mr. Poroshenko is now at this very moment addressing the Congress in the United States, despite the fact that his country is in raptures of a civil war. I see this situation when people get undeserved praise and when, sorry, but criminals don't get punishment in the West. Am I too pessimistic when I say this?
Well, I think there's a kind of powerful sense of political fantasy that prevails within Western diplomacy, and you're never quite sure whether it's a conscious selectivity with the facts, or whether it's kind of partial amnesia and just a desire not to face up to the facts. But you know, you heard, for example, President Obama just very recently talk about Somalia as a success story, when everybody fully understands that this is a failed state, fragmented, you know, facing major problems that are in part due to the series of interventions that the West conducted some time back. A long time ago, you have a situation where in Syria there's a total reluctance to face up to the fact that many of the weapons that the West had provided to the rebels almost effortlessly made its way into the hands of ISIL, and is now used against, sort of not just Assad, but against Western targets. And it's just as if these things have never happened. And I remember when I was traveling to a seminar recently, I was talking to some Americans about Libya and about the responsibility that America had in particular, but also other European countries, in overthrowing Gaddafi and actually making what was a relatively sort of fragile situation into a really horrible one. You know, it's gone from bad to worse by a long shot. And there seems to be no awareness or responsibility that these very destructive outcomes, you know, were not simply an act of God, but were the direct consequence of the West. And I almost think that literally whatever Western governments seem to touch these days just goes pear-shaped. And this goes back a long time. I remember very clearly, because you talked about Lebanon earlier on and how that seemed to work. I remember traveling in Yugoslavia before its breakup, and and talking to families where you had Serb and Croatian couples living in the same house, where there were relatively harmonious interactions between all the different communities. And one morning you wake up and you realize that, you know, a part of it has gone. The Germans have decided that Slovenia should be free from the rest of Yugoslavia, and before you know it, you create this kind of very destructive cycle of violence, and which still continues and will continue for some time to come. So I think that what's interesting is there's no accounting for these setbacks, and nor is there any recognition that actually in the very act of intervening and setting up these artificial governments and kind of investing hope in individuals that are really, sort of have got no real redeeming features, what you're doing is you're creating your own enemies that are going to strike back at you in the years to come.
Well, I think that this is a sad but truthful story. Correct me if I'm wrong, dear Kevin de Jesus, but I try to explain it to myself. I'm not into conspiracy theories. I don't believe in controlled chaos. Sometimes I get an impression that we're dealing here with just pure incompetence. I mean, being thousands of miles away and being sort of confused by all of these dozens of theories about the Middle East. I'm afraid people like Victoria Nuland or people like John McCain, they're just incompetent. They don't understand how these political machines work. And indeed, even the locals have a hard time deciding who should be running, say, Ukraine or Bosnia or the Middle East. In this situation, I think you have these favors of creating inclusive governments. I don't think it's because of evil intentions. It just shouldn't be this way. People from other countries located thousands of miles away, they should have little say in who is running the Ukrainian government or who is running the Lebanese government or the Syrian government for that matter.
Well, of course, that is in and of itself a political ideal, right? An ideal of non-meddling and non-intervention. However, we know that countries, varying locations and varying places on the hierarchy of world power to the middle power to the lesser power, in fact, have their interests. The question is there, I think, a positive role for international intervention in a sort of broad sense that works to try to help facilitate greater political representation of marginalized groups or groups that have historically been oppressed. This is, of course, a very complex matter in and of itself. The question of who should be doing the representation, the question of how do local political traditions and local political structures, such as, for instance, the Loya Jirga in Afghanistan as an instance of that, or the Shura in Arab Islamic cultures, these kind of consultative models. The question is, are they more organic? If they're more organic, do they, in fact, work more effectively to create plurality? Of course, with plurality, there is the likelihood of governments succeeding more robustly in terms of delivering what people need, and therefore the equation goes that we would see much greater political legitimacy that is, in fact, not imposed or upheld by other powers, but is, in fact, something born of the electorate and the polity of the people in the places in which we're discussing. There is quite a lot here, and the question really is, can we achieve, for instance, a certain level, and is it necessary, is it valid, for instance, to say a country such as Sweden, to try to intervene in a facilitative way in a situation such as in Syria? Unfortunately, in many countries in the West, the regime change has been, and as you've heard me comment critically on this issue other times with you folks at RIA, is that regime change as the exclusive agenda of a Western intervention into Syria is going to fail. This is what we saw in Iraq, and there are different agendas. It's like sort of pulling out a clipboard with, sort of the agenda of inclusive government, a clipboard with the agenda of regime change, a clipboard with building a new government. The question is, these are very different projects. This domino model that it just sort of falls and all happens is as we've heard political fantasy. So I think it's certainly, something that needs critique. The question is, does the West own this sort of intervention exclusively? I think not. But the question is, what we see in India calls for, a more inclusive approach to meeting the needs of the people in the world's largest democracy that includes an identity-based approach that is working to bring in and target underrepresented groups or groups that have very little political capital, to bring them into the web of government that is to provide a social safety net for its people. So we can't sort of throw the baby out with the bathwater in terms of the question of political representation, plurality.
Alexander Kuznetsov, Ukraine traditionally had this huge neighbor, Russia. For 350 years, most of Ukraine was a part of the Russian Empire. So naturally, Russia says, we know how Ukraine operates better than the EU or the United States. And the United States, knowing very little about Ukraine, still has been meddling. We have seen it during the Maidan. And the United States is full of self-assuredness that it can build the new Ukraine. To my mind, the results are disastrous because the relations between Russians and Ukrainians were very good. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. On the side of Ukrainians, there was sometimes a little resentment. On the side of Russians, there was just almost 100% sympathy. But we see now the things to develop according to the model which Frank already has just described for Yugoslavia. A happy country, and then suddenly parts of it become, ethnic states. And inside an ethnic state, another minority suddenly starts to feel bad. Because when you all lived inside a big empire, like Kosovo Albanians inside Yugoslavia, it was fine. But living in Serbia, a new nation state, turned out to be much less comfortable. So what do you think? I think that basically we live in a very complicated world where distant countries, for the first time, have got an ability to shape policies in the countries that they don't know, which are located far away and which are pretty developed, like Ukraine is a pretty developed area, or Yugoslavia, and they were shaped by the Western influences, and they were broken. I'm sorry.
Of course, you're absolutely right. I want to say that more than half of the Ukrainian population are Russian-speaking people. And also more than 14 million people who live in Russia consider themselves as Ukrainians.
Yes, and there was never any problem with that.
And there were never any problems. Some problems were in the Soviet time with the Western Ukraine after the Second World War. In only three regions of Ukraine, there was a separatist movement under the leadership of Ukrainian far-right nationalists who collaborated with Nazis during the Second World War.
Yes, which is understandable because Western Ukraine had never been a part of Russian Empire before. It was a part of Austria, part of Poland.
Empire, of Habsburg Empire, yes. And they consider themselves as a part of the European civilization, but not Russian. And, of course, the consequences of the American interference and European interference are disastrous because we can see the split in the Ukrainian society. Very, very, very tragic split. And just today I have spoken with my friend from Odessa by phone, and they said that some people in the city, they are for
Kiev, yes.
for Kiev, and some people for Moscow, which lived as neighbors and without any problems.
For many years.
For many years, yes. Now the big part of the Ukrainian population is forward some choice to whom they belong, to the Russian people, for example, or to the Ukrainian nation.
Yes.
And it's a very tragic choice. It's a very, 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 very tragic choice. These people were loyal to the Ukrainian state. I want to underline this. They wanted to live in Ukraine, and not only the southeast of the Ukraine, but in Kiev also. The majority of population were Russian-speaking. And now West artificially create the enemies from
division,
Ukraine.
This division.
From this division, they create enemies, and it will be a big split among the Ukrainian nation, and I consider that it will be a failed state.
Well, this is, I think, the voice of truth, which probably at least some people will hear right on the day when Mr. Poroshenko is being applauded by thousands of congressmen and thousands of people in Washington, and before he was applauded in Canada. Unfortunately, at home, things are not going very well. And I think this is a very grotesque situation when the president whose country is in a civil war, who actually failed to prevent a civil war, he is greeted as a hero in another country thousands of miles away, which simply does not understand what's going on in Ukraine. But I think, Frank Furedi, this is a question for you. I think we are coming to this very important conclusion. You know, if you want to create an inclusive government in another country, don't support splits inside that society. Don't divide the nation into the bad people and good people. I'm afraid this mistake was done by the West in Syria. I remember how the Western papers described Alawites as a sect and the Sunni majority as, you know, the oppressed Muslims. Why does the West do it? Is it inadvertent? Is it artificial? Is it some kind of failed strategy?
Well, I think it's the inevitable consequence of this kind of meddling and intervention. You have to remember that most societies have a very carefully balanced relationship between different communities that's taken often centuries to evolve, and where often the balance is a very precarious balance, as was the case in Syria. And therefore, sometimes all you need to do is to probe around a little bit, and you unleash a process that will have totally destructive consequences. I'm afraid I go further than some of the other speakers. I would like to throw out the baby with the bathwater, because when I look at the record of interventions that are initiated from outside, they invariably complicate situations. The idea that somehow you create democracy in somebody else's society, that the idea that somehow you empower people, groups and minorities, you do it for them in a very nice, helpful way, goes against the whole grain of human historical experience. People gain representation through their own action, through their ability to kind of shake off the yoke of their oppressors, through negotiations, through debate and discussions. It's not something that somebody from the outside does for you as a favor. And therefore, what we're seeing in Syria is not just simply, it's not so much a conscious outcome of stupid policies. It's the inevitable outcome, because intervention always carries with it a fairly corrosive sort of dynamic. It simply is not aware and does not understand the subtleties of the local regional situation. It has got no real understanding of the finely balanced way in which societies produce themselves and cooperate, and therefore it just goes in there. Next morning, you have the beginnings of a civil war, and that's been the experience really for the last 30 or 40 years.
Well, that's a very good point. I think Frank Furedi has expressed this radical but probably radically right view that, in fact, you know, when different communities live together, it doesn't come of itself. Just like, you know, childbirth is actually a very complicated phenomenon created by nature, if you want, by God, and attempts to artificially recreate it can be dangerous. Kevin, do you think that, in fact, probably the United States and the European Union should maybe limit their ambitions and be more careful in their future attempts to reform societies which are far removed from their borders?
Well, let me be clear about a couple things. First, when I was discussing throwing out the baby with the bathwater, I was talking about the question of inclusive government. I don't think that the West owns the question of inclusive government. In terms of intervention, I actually agree largely with Professor Furedi in that quite often it has led to great disasters. Now, the question is whether a society can sometimes benefit from facilitated discussions among warring parties from more neutral countries who have a non-hegemonic agenda. I do, for instance, regional involvement of organizations like ECOWAS, regional organizations like the Southern African Development Council, on and on and on, the Arab League and those kind of things. Now, greatly, those models do not work well. And in many questions, we have seen the countries like Morocco and the situation of Western Sahara, a failure to resolve these kind of conflicts. The question is, do we just sort of erase all that, which is one approach? Do we continue to work to refine certain approaches. Yes, in terms of meddling and in terms of sort of orchestrating the attainment of power, the manipulation of local structures, of course, I am opposed fully to that, and that is very far from what I'm talking about. I mean, we can look to situations like the Taif Accord, which, while it was backed by the United States, in many ways it was, a final means by which the government of Saudi Arabia could bring the warring parties in Lebanon to the table and finally forge out a political agreement that was able to, end the hostilities. It's imperfect as it is, and it certainly has not solved all of the problems with Lebanon, as we see this protracted inability to select a president. Of course, there is the concern of involvement of countries like the United States and others in trying to have a heavy hand in those kind of decisions. Certainly that is something that I would oppose and would be contrary to the kind of supports that sometimes political structures can benefit from in societies. The question is, again, sort of looking at whether it be a situation like South Sudan, where we see that people are chosen a referendum to decide to secede and create their own country. Unfortunately, we see in South Sudan a country where the political class has opted for great violence, serious struggles within the country to lead the country, and where they've led it largely at this juncture has been to a very chaotic and a very, very dangerous situation for the civilian country.
Thank you, Kevin. And I think that basically we're getting closer and closer to the end of our discussion. Summarizing what people have just said, my impression is that we have to get out of the vicious circle. It's my impression that since 1991 we're inside a sort of a vicious circle when the United States decides to remove this or that government, considering it outdated. And the media, unfortunately, immediately starts to work as a media arm of the government, demonizing certain political leaders, some of them not very savory characters like Saddam Hussein. But now we understand that people who replaced Saddam Hussein and who unleashed a civil war in Iraq were not much better, actually. In the same way, I think it should certainly be taken into account that historically there were success stories. The United States reformed Germany, post-war Germany, it reformed Japan, but these were countries which had been inside the Western sphere of influence, I would say the Western set of values for many years before the United States helped to introduce democracy in these countries. So, summarizing our conversation, I think it was useful, and I think that we can certainly agree that if foreign countries try to interfere into other countries' affairs and form inclusive governments there, they should be very careful. And that brings us to the end of this edition of our three-way discussion. We had Kevin DeJesus from the United States, we had Frank Furedi from London, and we had Alexander Kuznetsov from the Geo Arabica Research Center.